Once again, hello everybody. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and this show will be hosted also with Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always, and thank you for the promotion.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I went from guest to co-host. How about that?
Yeah, okay, we'll do that. So we have some movements in Ukrainian Russian uh, war negotiations, whatever it might be, special military operation, like Russia likes to call it. So now Ukrainian negotiators, together with American, they created so kind of a joint position where the essence of which is just to stop war everywhere in air, in sea, and on the front lines for 30 days. And in this 30 days, to work out on all pieces required for long-term peace, or at least mm, a temporary reprieve from the war, at least stop it for whatever it takes. And so far, the ball is now in the Russian court, the way I understand it. And the latest what I've heard is that Putin is saying that he agrees, but it requires much more work on details and so on and on. So, essence of Ukrainian and American uh, proposal is unconditional cease of fire, just period, stop fire for 30 days.
Mhm.
Now, I think Putin wants to attach some conditions to that. Jonathan, what do you think? Does Putin really understand the process to which US and Ukraine agreed, and he has no clue what it's all about?
I think Putin's. You remember that Putin himself is functioning within his own information bubble.
Yeah.
He is fed what his advisors tell him, and his advisors are obviously pushing the maximalist position, which is no concessions, just keep fighting. And even though from as objective sources as we can get from outside, the momentum of the Russian offensive is slowing. It's running out of steam. Yeah, the casualties have gone down, but that's because the violence of their offensive has gone down also. They don't have as much in the way of sound logistics to keep pushing the offensive. And so they keep rigidly adhering to no compromise, no, you must accept all of our stated agreements. You must cede those territories in the eastern Ukraine. And so right now, it's a contest of political will. And President Trump, to his credit, along with his advisors, have laid down a solid position. They have put the burden of response on Russia. They have successfully negotiated with Ukraine, got the position they want to move forward with, and now they are forcing Russia to either respond or continue a costly war. And it is made clear that the U.S. will increase aid to Ukraine if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire.
Well, right now, although they didn't say definite yes or no, although whatever they are saying sounds to me more like a no than yes, on the front lines, the casualties still continue. There is no stoppage of Russian attacks, bombardment of Ukrainian cities, or so on. Also, I must emphasize that U.S. now is continuing to military support Ukraine, and all logistics and the electronic data, everything is in place now. So even more so, the Russians have a short window of opportunity, a few days when there's intelligence service, and they use it very skillfully. For example, they are almost got Ukrainians out of Kursk region, Platsdarm that Ukrainian had seized in August. And furthermore, there is now a very troublesome position where Ukrainians who were caught because of this from their main forces, um, they're now, as Putin said, they will be treated as terrorists. And it seems to me that they have a horrible choice, either fight and be all killed in a very short period of time, or be tried as terrorists or be treated as terrorists, which probably even worse by Russian forces. So it's very interesting what Trump leverage has to cure this situation, which was possible only because of the U.S. withholding its intelligence from Ukraine.
Well, again, it's going to be interesting to see what develops here because again, President Trump wants to be seen as a peacemaker and a successful deal maker. And if the Russians attempt to continue to thwart that, the history of President Trump's behavior is if you hit President Trump, he will hit back harder. And that has been his pattern. So we may see greatly increased military assistance from the U.S. if Russia continues to be intransigent with this. And also, they may give Ukraine greater permissions and greater license to be able to do what it is doing. And there may be other things in cooperation with its European NATO allies. So there's still much that can be played by the U.S. in favor of Ukraine. And Ukraine, again, I would argue, still has that hidden hole card, that hidden counteroffensive opportunity that it maybe have been holding in reserve up until a moment like this.
Yeah, it's interesting that Ukraine using their own weapons produced in Ukraine by Ukrainians, they're hitting targets 1,500 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, and they are very efficient in hitting these targets. Mostly it's oil refineries, and that hurts Russians because they really need this oil for front lines to sell. And although selling now is becoming quite questionable, if Trump will keep all these oil tariffs, not only against Russia, but also countries which are involved in trading Russian oil.
Yeah. And also keep in mind that the Ukraine's successful deep strikes, although they don't have as immediate an effect on Russian offensives, they will be significant. They are cumulative. The damage is cumulative. And it is going to have an increasing effect on Russia's ability to continue its offensive operations. So this is, again, something to watch. Ukraine is successfully striking at the Russian rear areas, and this will continue. Then they have their own capability to do so. They don't have to ask they don't have to ask the U.S. or its NATO allies, may we strike deep at these targets? No, they're going to do it because they have the capability now. So this is all very interesting. And they're not striking directly at the front lines of Russia, although they have the drones and the other capabilities to do so. They're going to strike deep with their drones and other missiles, and they're going to rely as heavily upon drones as possible to continue to inflict superior casualties on the attacking Russian troops. And this is all having a cumulative effect. We're seeing it over time. We're seeing that the force of their offensive is continuing to slow. And interestingly enough, it reflects the old Soviet military doctrine. In Colonel A.A. Sidorenko's book, The Offensive, which was written as part of the Soviet Officers' Library series in the 1960s. In it, Sidorenko emphasized density of volume of fire over time. In other words, according to his theory, if you could using World War II examples where the Russians concentrated a very large amount of artillery fire, several thousand artillery pieces at the beginning of an offensive, over a very short period of time. He asserted that this contributed to higher rates of advance of the Soviet armed forces. Now, a fact that he conveniently left out was that he never mentioned at all the beneficial effect that the supplying of U.S. Ford trucks to the Soviet Union in large numbers contributed greatly to strengthening their logistical capability and thus their ability to sustain a mobile offensive over time, which eventually drove the Nazis out of Soviet Union. So the implication for this is that high rates of fire, that's all very nice. If you blow a hole in the enemy's lines, that's all very nice. But if you don't have the logistical capability to support it, there's nothing to exploit with your offensive exploitation forces.
Jonathan, there are plenty of horses and donkeys to do the mobility.
They're now down. They're down to donkeys apparently. Yeah, and they're talking about using. Oh, good Lord! They're talking about using one step above tricycles to try to get their troops in there, but they clearly do not have the mobile logistical capability to sustain a mobile offensive against the Ukrainian forces, and they are hoping that firepower such as they have will be able to substitute for this. But if they cannot supply reliably their exploitation forces, they are going to continue to have difficulties, and it's only going to increase over time.
I had a quick,
Mark.
I just had a quick question for both of you because I know that it's come up a couple of times. Well, two questions. One, I heard that the Kursk region had been, recaptured or something along those lines, and I was just wondering your take on that and everything. But my other question that's more important is North Korea. Is supplying all these soldiers. Is there the possibility, because the Russians have a sphere of influence, that they will bring in soldiers from other countries as kind of their fodder for their casualties and all along those lines? So I just wanted your take on that, because they did bring in the North Koreans, and they do have like some African nations and some Asian nations that are under their influence as well. So maybe they'll go get the Cubans.
And if they do, it's simply a sign of greater desperation on their part. Because the Nazis also had their minor allies in World War II on the Eastern Front. And they brought in the Hungarians and Italians in 1942. And they had brought in the Romanians at the beginning of the war. And to a certain extent, they had some help from the Finns, but really it was basically, the Finns were allying with the Nazis to basically keep the Soviet Union out of Finland. So but in any case, the quality of these troops is not any greater than those of the Russians and the ones they're bringing in. And the Russians are increasingly being forced to rely upon conscripts. They don't have the professional Russian army anymore that they at least ostensibly had at the beginning. So this is going to be a very interesting problem for them. It's not a sign of continuing growing strength. It is a sign of growing desperation.
Now, it's a very interesting moment. You know that there is a lot of recruitment in Russian jails for people to go to the front lines. And if they will survive for 6 months, they have freedom. And a lot of them...
The trick is surviving for 6 months,
Yeah, but now it's a good time for them actually to consider to go in recruitment, simply because if there will be a peace, they may in fact survive 6 months and be a free man.
And the trick there is don't be the last person to die. Don't be like that unlucky American soldier at the end of World War I who died 1 minute before the armistice went into effect.
Oh, wow, not that last minute person. Hey, Jonathan, just really quickly, what is your take, and this is for Sasha as well, as to what could create a ceasefire? Because like I said, we talked about on World Edition just briefly as I started the show and we had guests and everything. But what is the notion around this ceasefire, and what would it take to get a ceasefire? What does Trump want for a ceasefire? I guess what I'm really asking.
Ceasefire is a ceasefire.
Yeah, stop firing. Basically you keep, in this case, the way President Trump is playing it, with his apparent actions. He's going to continue to improve. Remember, he said we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way.
Yes.
And President and Putin is apparently choosing the hard way, at least as far as we can tell. He's going to be when the Russian offensive and casualties and damage that the Ukrainians are continuing to inflict reach a point where the Russians simply cannot continue the offensive any longer, where they have reached what Clausewitz calls the culminating point of the offensive, where they've simply run out of gas, and then that's when a ceasefire is going to attack, when they can no longer conduct effective offensive operations. And the Russians are going to be very stubborn about it, but okay, if they choose to be stubborn, so be it. And they will, and when they are forced to declare a ceasefire, they will, in accordance with their propaganda techniques and disinformation and everything else, they will declare victory. They will declare victory and then ceasefire, even when they've been thoroughly pummeled. And that will be accelerated if Ukraine succeeds in launching that surprise counteroffensive that I contend all along would be in Crimea.
Jonathan, there is something else. What I'm thinking about is that actually two things. Number one, surprisingly, Putin and Russians never learned from what happened to Zelensky 2 weeks ago in Oval Office. All, in my opinion, never mind whether it was a trap by, what's his name, J.D. Vance and so on. It doesn't really matter. What matters to me is that Zelensky and Trump and both teams had very different goals and a view of the process. You know, in Trump's mind, it was a process of agreeing to a peace, number one. And only when you accomplish this, you may discuss some other issues. In the minds of Zelensky and his team was to agree on security guarantees and this and that is in one package, and it was in complete detriment of what Trump was trying to do. And
both parties had their priorities reversed.
Yes. Finally, it was all solved out. Ukrainians learned, okay, this is the way, whether we like it or not, but that's how we should do it, and let's try at least. Okay, they tried it, and so far it works. Now, with Russians, they knew all that. Why? They didn't take this as a lesson to first agree to a ceasefire for 1 month. And then you start saying, we want this and we want that, and let's try this and that. But while fire has been stopped, you can decide all that. But what Russians are saying, and I've seen some of this, their so-called propaganda people, that this is a clever ploy of Americans and Ukrainians to have a stop to war for 1 month, so Ukrainians will get even more weapons and ammunition, and they will reorganize, and they will have a rest for 1 month, and then they will start decisive attack against Russia and will go directly to Moscow. This is why we should not accept this proposal at all costs, because otherwise we will lose our fatherland and motherland and all kinds of lands.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I've heard on Russian propaganda.
And keep in mind, Sasha, the Russian government and its media, they have no self-correcting mechanism. No. They do not have contrary voices or even reasonably objective sources of information that can issue a necessary corrective to what they think they are perceiving. So they are going to continue it. They are locked into their own mindset, and they are projecting. It's a function of their security strategy of bezopasnost, without danger. So long as the enemy exists and it has any significant means of power, they are a threat. Their mere existence is a threat.
Yes, Mark.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, because I don't know. I remember at the beginning of the war, there was talks about it and everything. Is there any sort of peace movement in Russia? Because much in the way that there was a peace movement in Vietnam that is kind of counter to the war and is trying to encourage a ceasefire or encourage some sort of negotiations. Because like I said, if you go back to the U.S. and the Vietnam War, there was a whole peace movement that existed.
Yeah, but the U.S.
Is there a counter
U.S. in Vietnam, the U.S. public in Vietnam had a lot more freedom to protest and ability to protest without fear of massive suppression by the U.S. government. I mean, locally, some suppression of protesters occurred, but not on a wide scale. In Russia, any peace movement that occurred would have to occur only if the Russian government itself were on the verge of collapse.
Actually, I would like to mention, Jonathan, is that in 80s, when it were last days of the Soviet Union, there were much more freedom than in today's Putin, because there were mothers of boys fighting in Afghanistan. They had a huge protest, and that actually affected that the war finally was over in Afghanistan. And today, these mothers, they have so many more boys being killed today in 3 years in Ukraine than in 9 years in Afghanistan.
Yep.
Well, the numbers are almost 1 million killed here in Ukraine, and 15,000 of Russians were killed in Afghanistan. And yet it was a very powerful movement. Today, they're losing so many fathers, brothers, husbands, and so on, and they're quiet. Can you imagine that? What kind of suppression is going on in Russia?
There has to be a great deal more suppression going on based on what you just told me than we would have had previously. And that suppression, once the lid comes off, it's going to explode, and the results for Russia will be devastating. And what we in the West must be looking into. In the meantime, we have to learn to be keeping our powder dry and keeping ourselves and looking to reinforce, at the very least, ballistic missile defense. And maximally, I would advocate to the Trump administration what I've been advocating all along here and for past several decades: worldwide strategic defense matrix, wisdom, and don't build any more nuclear weapons.
Jonathan, I have one practical question. You see, all ceasefires in history, they were in times where drones haven't existed yet. Now, today with the drones, let's say there is a ceasefire, day 2, 5, 10 days. On 11 days, some guys, for fun, they build and put up a drone which killed a few Russians, or Russians will do.
And that would be considered violation of it. That would be considered by the Russians violation of the ceasefire.
Yeah, and how you deal with that?
You don't. You can't.
You can't.
So like I say, ceasefires, if assuming that the Russians agree to one, if they do develop a serious ceasefire and in effect a de facto armistice, then the Ukrainians would have to exert extraordinary self-restraint in order to say, okay, we have time to regroup and we have time to get our additional supplies and so forth. The better conditions for such a ceasefire would be, I contend, after a significant operational victory by Ukraine and its forces against the Russian, not necessarily in the eastern Ukrainian oblasts, although that would be, it wouldn't have as big an effect as the recovery of Crimea. Much more decisive, and it would have a paralyzing effect on Russian naval presence in the Black Sea, which has been steadily decreasing and becoming less and less effective. So there are all sorts of good strategic and operational opportunities for both the U.S. and Ukraine that are emerging, and it's a matter of again, political will, perseverance, and in the larger sense, the U.S. has to concentrate now on developing a larger, more comprehensive national security strategy, and for the rest of the 21st century, a coherent grand strategy that fulfills what the U.S. role ought to be in the Western Hemisphere and in the world at large for the remainder of the 21st century. This has not been a habit. Well, we did it successfully during the Cold War, but that was because we developed a defensive grand strategy. Now, this one would be somewhat more ambitious in the sense of establishing, in accordance with President Trump's motto of America First, that can be interpreted several ways. And so it has to be coherently and it has to be well thought out. It has to be consistently executed. It cannot be chaotic. You can't have your allies trying to guess what you're going to do next, because that can be, being unpredictable has its advantages. It keeps your opponents off balance, but it also keeps your allies off balance. And so until they figure out what your thinking really is.
John, but I think Russia right now is in horribly losing all the way situation, simply because let's imagine that they disagree to a peace proposal either right away, or most likely they will ask a little bit here and a little bit there, and they have to think about this and they have to evaluate that, or so on. And Trump will lose patience. I think that Trump's patience probably is good for 1 week. Well, anything more than a week, I don't think that he will tolerate, really. So,
and if so, he'll just jack up the pressure.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what Russia is playing against. One way or another, they're rejecting that, and Ukraine will be washed with all kind of weapons, and of course, all means of surveillance and electronic data and so on. So Russia, even before, they were not in the best possible shape, but now it will be even much worse than ever before.
And just wait till President Trump's energy policies kick more fully into play. And the price of oil comes down and Russia starts losing revenue from that source. So again, it's because the Russians don't have they are not the world's reserve currency. They cannot engage in deficit spending. If they do, it's catastrophic for them. They don't have the resources.
And furthermore, U.S. can restrict China and India from buying Russian oil altogether because of sanctions against third countries would kick in, and that's another major blow. And now their so-called secret dark fleet of tankers that are transporting Russian oil, there will be severe restrictions. There are already some restrictions, but if they will stop them altogether, that's the end of Russian oil trade. And without that, I don't think they can survive more than a few months, really. I really don't see how. And Ukrainians...
It's going to run out of gas, both literally and economically.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a lot of situation where Russia will suffer as a result of their refusal. And let's see if all Trump's plan is implemented. So there is a month, okay, it could be prolonged to 2 months or so. So they will work through all conditions and so on. And let's see, in a fantastic like scenario, all sides will agree to something. The end of war, or at least this stage of the war, done. So what Russia has, it has its economy, which is being devastated, to put it mildly, and it has now 4, so make it 5 Ukrainian territories that it would acquire as a result of the war, most likely, which are being devastated, which have to, they have minefields. It's unlivable territory. What's it going to do about that?
Well, they certainly aren't going to be able to do much, because Russia is going to be faced, assuming an armistice or some sort of prolonged ceasefire on the model of North and South Korea. Even if that takes place, the Russians are going to be suffering from both economic dislocation as well as demographic problems. Their demographic problems were significant enough before because of the severe casualties they've taken in this war. Their demographic problems, birth rate problems, will be even greater in the years following this conflict. So is their recovery, any military recovery sufficient to enable them to even think about starting another war, will be severely curtailed. And this again buys time for the West, for its European allies, for NATO to rethink and reorient itself. And those who have been claiming that NATO is now effectively destroyed, I think, are being very premature.
Hopefully so. Yeah, I really hope so. Jonathan, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
Oh,
And
very useful ground too.
yeah, I would like to thank you very much for today's program, and have a great weekend, and all our listeners. And we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Glory to Ukraine. Bye bye.